People pay good money to see this movie. When they go out to a theater, they want cold sodas, hot popcorn, and no monsters in the projection booth.
Everyone pretend podcasting isn't boring.
Turn it off. Turn it off.
夢というのはなぜ覚めるのでしょう。一生覚めなければ夢は夢でなくなるのに。
ほらきれない暗闇は二人の愛の火を灯し手に手を取って歩こう My honey 微笑み忘れずに
Hey folks, welcome to a special episode of the Projection Booth. On this episode, I am talking with Will Carroll, the author of Suzuki Seijun and Postwar Japanese Cinema, and Peter Tatara, the brand new director of film at the Japan Society and founder of Anime NYC. Spoke with both of these gentlemen all about a program of Suzuki Seijun films that is coming up at the Japan Society starting this week. That's February 3rd, 2023. Though you can see this program in other places, it will be heading into Canada in April of 2023. I highly recommend that you check out as many Suzuki films as you possibly can, and this is a great place to start. Enjoy the interview. Will, I have to tell you, I picked up your book a few months ago, and I have been wanting to interview you since then, so I'm glad that we're able to talk now, though this is more in the conjunction of the events that are happening at the Japan Society that Peter is putting on. So like I said before we started recording, I would have figured that you guys had already talked before this, but I'm so glad to be able to make this connection with the two of you.
Absolutely thrilled. Yeah, I am a new member of the Japan Society team. I think Will has worked in detail with a colleague of mine, Alexander Fee, who I'm sure we'll speak about later in the podcast. But I am Japan Society's new director of film, having been there for all of 2.5 weeks at this point.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear that you've been reading the book and enjoying it. And yeah, I'm happy to be here to talk to you about it and about the series.
What got you into Seijun Suzuki?
When I was an undergraduate, I was kind of working my way steadily through like all of the films at the library that were released by Criterion Collection way back when. And I don't know how I came upon this exactly, but one night I had just rented a bunch of them and I made a double feature out of All That Heaven Allows and Branded to Kill. And that was the first time I ever saw a Suzuki film. I have to say I actually didn't really like or get it the first time I saw it. I was just like very perplexed. And it wasn't until a few months later when I first saw Tokyo Drifter that I got intrigued enough to seek out some more rare things, I guess. Later on, when I was in graduate school, I was taking a graduate seminar on sort of Japanese film theory, and I sort of learned in that seminar that Suzuki kind of stood at the intersection of a variety of different sort of theoretical and cultural trends around Japanese cinema, all of which I was really interested in. And by that point, I was also just a very big fan of his films.
And Peter, what brings you to the Japan Society?
I've got a history over 20 years working with Japanese media and live events. I am the former head of guest and programming at New York Comic Con. I'm the founder of an event called Anime NYC, which is the largest or the second largest Japanese pop culture convention in the US. But Japan Society approached me about the opportunity to work with Japanese content all year round in the US or all year round in New York and take the reins of Japan Cuts, which is Japan Society's annual summer film festival that hadn't occurred in recent years because of COVID. And it was impossible to resist being able to work with this organization that I've long respected and bring Japan Cuts back to life.
What is the whole idea behind Japan Cuts?
So Japan Cuts is the largest contemporary Japanese film festival in North America. So it's run every year since 2007, with the exception of the COVID years, and annually presents 30 plus films along with special guest directors and actors from Japan, really showcasing wonderful new works from Japan that typically don't have any other distribution or really any other screening opportunities in North America. It's one of, I think, the highlights of New York's film festival scene. It's something I've attended almost every year as a fan. To have the opportunity now to put my fingerprints on the next stage of it is, again, just absolutely irresistible.
So, Will, what was it about Seijun Suzuki that appealed to you enough to write an entire book about him?
Largely just realizing he was sort of a figure who inspired the sort of nascent cinephile movement in Japan in the 1960s. And when you're starting to see the emergent of like independent film societies, both people screening films sort of independently of the studio distribution system, and also like 8 and 16 millimeter independent film production. Like many people working at, say, Wakamatsu Production Company, that is, were big fans of his and later collaborators. The filmmaker Obayashi Nobuhiko, who is famous for making House, was someone who was writing to film journals under pen names about Suzuki's films while he was making some of his 8 millimeter independent work around like the early 60s as well. So his connection to those sorts of things really interested me. In addition to the fact that his films, and at that point I was mostly just focused on the 60s ones, the fact that they were just so bizarre, but also, very fun and easy to get into. At that point, I wasn't necessarily thinking about sort of the later, more difficult ones yet, although eventually I did get into those quite a bit as well.
Easy to get into, but difficult to find with subtitles for a lot of titles. I mean, over the years, Cold as My Passport, Detective Bureau 23, these things have slowly been coming out with subtitles, but there's still a lot of films of his that are not subtitled in English.
That's true. And actually, the first time I wrote a paper on Suzuki was like my senior year of undergraduate, which was about I guess spring 2009. And at that point, there were far fewer films of his that had been released, and basically no other Nikatsu filmmakers kind of working in similar genres that had been released at that point, sort of as a point of comparison, I think apart from maybe Crazed Fruit. So it was a really difficult time at that point to track down VHS copies of unsubtitled films, and my Japanese language skills were not as high as they are now at that point. So that was very tough. The fact that Suzuki passed away in 2017 at the age of 93, I guess, that is actually a large part of why I was able to see all of his films and in very good formats, because it just so happened I was on a research trip in Japan when like all of the major sort of repertory movie theaters in Tokyo started doing like very extensive retrospectives of his work. And they played all but I think about 2 of his theatrically released films in 35 millimeter. So I was able to watch them that way. And also as a graduate student, I programmed a series at the Film Society at University of Chicago that brought in a lot of subtitled prints from Japan Foundation of some of his rarer films. So I was able to see a lot of them in very good formats that way.
At the University of Chicago, Will had worked with a colleague of mine at Japan Society named Alexander Fee. Alexander was one of the chief people at Doc Films at University of Chicago. So way back when, that first Suzuki series was Alexander and Will, and thrilled now that this spiritual successor brings them back together.
Alexander is someone I was consulting when I was putting this sort of package of 6 films together, even before I had really gotten funding secured or anything secured with Japan Foundation.
Looking at the history of Suzuki and just, his politics, were there any challenges with approaching Japan Foundation to help fund this series? It's very interesting to see, this gonzo, bizarre, goofy leftist director now being the subject of this Japan Foundation retrospective.
I never got any pushback from Japan Foundation regarding these films at all. And somewhat surprisingly, just thinking about Suzuki's history with Nikatsu. Nikatsu at this point is also sort of very interested in not only promoting their own historical catalog abroad, but like really playing up their history with Suzuki and showing a lot of his films, which, given the antagonism around the way he was fired at the end of the 60s, is a little bit surprising. But one thing that has been that's made it much easier to study Suzuki than perhaps some other filmmakers around that time, and I'm not going to name any specific studios here, there are some major Japanese studios that are not at all interested in having their historical films getting any kind of release, and will probably ignore you if you try to approach them for rights or films or anything. So the fact that Nikatsu and also Shochiku, the other studio that's the rights holder for a number of his films, are 2 that are interested in that sort of thing, does make programming a lot easier for me.
Looking at distilling his body of work down to 6 films, what led you to the final 6 films that are part of the retrospective?
Part of it is just a matter of what is in the Japan Foundation's film library. And from programming events with them in the past, I had a sense of what they did and didn't have, because obviously to get things shown throughout North America, you need English subtitled film prints. So I was already working with kind of those limitations in mind. The idea was, instead of to represent what I think are his best films or maybe his most famous films, was to pick a representative sample of different stages of his work. So there are 2 films that are like early Nikatsu films. Satan's Town, which is sort of a film noirish crime thriller, more in line with what you might expect from him. And then also Love Letter, which is a film built around like a romantic song. It's only about 40 minutes long, and it's this very lush romance that was filmed on location in northern Japan. 40 minutes long, black and white cinema scope with like kind of remarkable dolly and crane shots in like difficult locations. So it's a bizarre movie for reasons that you don't usually think a Suzuki movie will be bizarre. But it's also, I remember Alexander really liking that film, which is also part of why I included it. Tokyo Drifter and Carmen from Kawachi for the late Nikatsu period, which is what he's probably most famous for at this point. And I knew I needed one that was a recognizable title, which is why I used Tokyo Drifter, because I think it is maybe an easier gateway film for people who aren't familiar with his work than Branded to Kill might be, or even Gate of Flesh. Whereas Carmen from Kawachi, I think, is one of his best films from that period, but it's not one that's available apart from this 35 millimeter print that Japan Foundation has. And then for the post-Nikatsu period, one of the Taisho films, obviously, but also one of his sort of forgotten masterpieces in my mind, A Tale of Sorrow and Sadness, which is actually probably my favorite film in this selection of his works, which is a very bizarre kind of TV satire, which is the industry he'd been working in for about 10 years at this point, that kind of starts out almost like a straightforward sort of corporate satire that just gets sort of more bizarre as it goes on before ending up like someplace totally different from where you expected when it was starting.
Obviously, you're talking about the Nikatsu period and the post-Nikatsu. Do you divide it up by that, or are there other ways of slicing his career up?
There's not really a scientific way to do it, especially within the Nikatsu period itself, which is, 40 films that he made in about 11 years, and one television episode. Just because traditionally, when people have started paying attention to his work, like starts in about 1963, usually with like Youth of the Beast, followed by Kanto Wanderer. The Flowers and the Angry Waves was actually one that a lot of people, like his fans in film clubs, were writing about at the time, but it's not as well known now. And of course, Gate of Flesh. Those are the films where you start to see these like sort of independent film journals and film societies talking about a lot when they were released. So I kind of use that as like the marking point for the late Nikatsu period. Yeah, starting in 63 through the end of that. And then anything before that as sort of the early Nikatsu period, although you could divide it up even further than that.
And Peter, tell me a little bit more as far as like some of these programs that you're inheriting and then what you're doing going forward.
The Seijun Suzuki Centennial. This has been a touring program that Will has worked together with Japan Foundation to create. So this has, throughout the course of 2022, has played at Bard, Duke, Berkeley. We're thrilled to present it at Japan Society in New York this February. And I think it's also playing in LA at American Cinematheque later in February. So this was a complete piece that I'm thrilled to now host, but did not have any part in the actual programming of. Looking at moving forward at Japan Society this year, we will be presenting the next installment of the Globus film series, which is our annual spring film series that has run the gamut over the past 15 years, exploring different directors and movements in Japanese cinematic history. So we'll be doing our latest installment of that. And hopefully end of February, we'll announce the theme and the topic of this. But I think the first real programs that I'll start to be co-curating and creating together with Alexander will be Japan Cuts this year. The big news is that Japan Cuts is back in person after a far too long of a delay because of COVID. And we should be able to, knock on wood, start making announcements in March about the Japan Cuts dates and some of the first films we're looking to present at the return of that live action festival. Overall, like my goals at Japan Society, we've typically been an organization that pays tribute to the history of Japanese cinema. And what I really want to do is balance that together with really an acute understanding of what Japan means today. My whole background, spending 20 years within Japanese media and live events, is seeing the power of anime and manga and what that has done to bring a whole new generation into discovering Japan. You talk to anyone under the age of 30, and their window to Japan has largely been pop culture, and wanting to find a balance between the glorious history of Japan society and Japanese cinema with the new young and broad audiences that love Japan, and just what is it about anime and animation that it really brought them into discovering this whole new world of cinema that they'd never seen before.
Will, all of these films are on 35?
All of them are on 35. I think some of the places that have been doing retrospectives have added like a couple DCPs of other films. Like I know Rochester, which is playing them now, or the George Eastman Museum in Rochester, which is playing them now, I think added a DCP of Branded to Kill. And I guess Berkeley has their own 35 millimeter print of Fighting Elegy, so they played that as well. But the 6 films that are playing at Japan Society are all on 35 millimeter.
Any chance of these coming to Detroit anytime soon?
I mean, I wish. I looked for venues in that area. I actually grew up in Birmingham, Michigan. So that is actually a place that I really wanted to show a couple of these films. So if you know of any good venues that can play 35 millimeter in that area, and can like get me in contact with them, I would be very happy to try at this point. The one venue that I did try was the Michigan Theater in Ann Arbor, which I was told was like their programming was already kind of too booked up too far in advance for us to get there.
For folks that aren't in the know, where are these actually showing? Where is the Japan Society Theater?
Of course, yeah. So Japan Society is right in Midtown Manhattan. We're at 333 East 47th Street. Japan Society is a year-round institution. We are home to gallery, a dedicated theater, language classes, all sorts of Japanese art, culture, and education. So definitely encourage audiences to come in for the Suzuki Centennial, but also see all the other activities we have going, again, every other day of the year.
And Will, I know a lot of people listening to this have probably seen Tokyo Drifter because that one, as you said, it's been available for a while. But a lot of these other films aren't, especially things like Carmen. That is not. I think I have a laser disc of that with no subtitles. So finally being able to see this with subtitles was fantastic. What can people expect with this program?
Part of my intention with the book and also with the program is to give people a better idea of Suzuki's filmography as a whole. Certainly, I think something like Love Letter is probably going to challenge people's assumptions about the kind of filmmaker Suzuki is. And there are actually quite a few other early films in his, or not just early films, other films in his filmography that aren't very well known that kind of are in the more melodramatic mode. And he was actually fairly good at that, partly because prior to being at Nikatsu, he was apprenticing at Shochiku under a director who specialized in melodrama. But once you realize that, you can also kind of see sort of techniques that are more closely associated with melodrama being used in very bizarre ways in a lot of his other films. Just like some of the ways that he uses elements of weather, often in very kind of unnatural and almost overdone for dramatic effect ways like that. And in addition to that, I think it'll hopefully just get the sense out that there are many more worthwhile films in his filmography that are not widely available, and hopefully get people interested enough that we can see more of them get more widely released soon.
And Peter, where's the best place for people to pick up tickets for this event?
Right at japansociety.org.
Well, thank you so much, gentlemen. It was such a pleasure talking with you today.
Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.